The Speaking of Cults podcast is presented solely for general informational, educational, and entertainment purposes. The use of information on this podcast or materials linked from it is at the user's own risk. The views, information, or opinions expressed by the host and guests are solely those of the individuals involved and do not constitute medical or other professional advice. Hello and welcome to the Speaking of Cults podcast. This is Chris Shelton, your host. Thank you very much for joining me this week. I am really pumped about my guest this week. I am welcoming Pat Ryan. He is a couple weeks ago, we had Ashlyn Hilliard on as a guest, and we talked openly about cult interventions. And she has name dropped Pat a couple times because she works with Pat. I have had the pleasure of working with Pat a couple times on some intervention work, and we have had many conversations. In fact, it's impossible for us to talk without getting into these conversations about cults and belief and just fascinating stuff. And so over the years, I just want to sort of say, and this isn't an ego boost for Pat, this is more of my acknowledgement of him, but I really need to let you guys know, as my audience, that so much of what I know and the attitude with which I have approached this subject has been heavily inspired by what Pat and his partner Joe have gotten across to me, and when I worked with them on some cases about things, for example, like if you are going to interfere with somebody's life in a significant way, like going and doing a cult intervention, you have to have a little conversation with yourself first about whether that's actually something you should be doing and whether that's actually the thing to do and whether that's the right decision to be making. It's not a black and white, good and bad thing. That level of nuance and care and the attitude about it really impacted me and really made me think a lot harder about this topic and what we're doing. So I've wanted to have Pat on my show for years. I reached out to him finally and said, hey, why don't we do this? And he was like, yeah, absolutely. So Pat, welcome to my show. Thank you very much for being here. And how would you describe yourself professionally and to the world?
That's, I think I'm a lot of different things, but if I'm anything, it's someone who wants to bring people together to communicate about very difficult subjects, because I believe that to facilitate change, one has to have a relationship. And so we try to do and, frame, no matter how abhorrent someone's ideas or the life that they live is, you got to have a relationship with them if you want to get them to change. And so how do you do that? And so I sometimes think of a photographer for the LA Times who is in Syria and children are dying. And their job is to be a photographer. And that's to take pictures and document. And they see a child being horrible things happen to them. And they have a choice. They could try to save that child, or they can do their job, which is to document what people are doing to the children.
Right.
And so it's sitting with uncomfortable things is, I guess, what we do. And is we sit with uncomfortable things and uncomfortable topics and try to find an area that we can find some area of agreement on, something that we can talk about that is not so emotionally charged. So if anything, what we try to do is teach families how to get along or how to build bridges with someone or an idea or people that we don't agree with.
Excellent. Well, I've got a few kind of get to know you questions so that the audience can kind of learn a little bit more about you. And so why don't we start off with, you've been doing cult intervention work. You've been working with people. You've given, probably at this point, hundreds of talks and various things at conferences. So you've been doing this work for almost as long as I've, been around. And how did you,
about
40
45
years, right? How did you get into this business in the first place?
So it started with me being in a group. So when I was in high school, I learned transcendental meditation. And transcendental meditation at that time was being taught in the public school systems, not every school, but in some schools in New Jersey, Kansas, and California. It was a very popular self-improvement technique. This is where the human potential movement in the 70s was very large. And Maharishi Mahesh Yogi appeared on the Merv Griffin show, a talk show at that era. I say the Merv Griffin, most people I talk to, they go, "What's that?" Because they're too young.
I remember.
Okay, all right. So he appeared on the Merv Griffin show with Burt Reynolds, Mary Tyler Moore, Clint Eastwood, a few physicians. And they talked about the benefits of meditation, blood pressure getting lower, and things like that. So I grew up in St. Petersburg, Florida, right next to Clearwater. And the population was generally a bit older. And so this idea of lowering blood pressure was appealing. So I was I wrote for my high school newspaper and tangentially connected to a junior achievement company with the St. Petersburg Times. And when Maharishi appeared on the Merv Griffin show, about 40,000 people were learning TM every month in the US. And one of the largest centers was St. Petersburg. So my next door neighbor had learned. I went to write a story about it. And when I walked in, there were some very famous athletes. So the Philadelphia Phillies spring train next to St. Petersburg. And so as I recall, there was Larry Boak, Pete Rose, there was all these athletes. And there's this kid, I think I just turned 17. And the man who taught me to meditate taught athletes. And so it was kind of like a little bit of a blowaway for a kid to go in. So I learned to meditate. And I became like a zealot. I remember someone telling me I was a zealot. But soon after that, about 10 days later, Maharishi was going to be in the United States in Atlanta. And I asked my father if I could go to Atlanta, high school. And he said, "Yes, but you have to be in school the next morning." So we were on a charter with a bunch of others. It was a DC-3, I think, 2 propellers on the side. It was horrible. I get so sick. And we went to Atlanta, a long flight. I think it probably took 3.5 hours, which now would be a short flight. We saw Maharishi, and he had inaugurated the World Plan and announced that they had found research that indicated that when 1% of the population meditated, crime rate went down. So...
Oh, wow.
Yes. So the next day, when I'm in class, I forgot what class it was, but we were given a metaphorical $1 million in small groups to solve world problems. And so, everybody was coming up with something. I said, well, I just came back from Atlanta and there was a Nobel Prize winner and there was all these famous doctors talking about how if you can get enough people meditating, about 1%, the crime rate would go down, and this would be an approach. And around my high school, which was more like a college high school, people were coming up to me. Like, "Pat, tell me about this. What about this?" So I was like, somehow, there was a little ego inflation that took place. So I was volunteering. I'm in high school at the TM Center. And then the TM teachers encouraged me to take an advanced course. It was a month-long course, a week-long course. And it was being taught by Mia Farrow's sister, Prudence Bruns, the woman that the song "Dear Prudence, Won't You Come Out and Play" is written about. And so I go to this residence course, we were called, and her husband was the state coordinator, and she encouraged me I should go to Maharishi International University. And I came home and I tell my dad, I'm not going to the University of Florida. We're going to the Maharishi International University. And he's from South Dakota, works to school every day. He's like, hell, you are. And I'm like, I'm going. And you have a choice. That's where I'm going. You can either support me and have a relationship with me, or don't support me and don't have a relationship with me. So they had me talk to the priest, and then I got the priest to meditate. They had a friend who was a shrink. They wanted me to talk to that person. I got them to meditate. So everybody they asked me to talk to virtually, I got to meditate. And so it was heady because when someone learned to meditate, there were people who helped in the process that prepared the person to go in to the room where they're going to learn, to get them to take out their shoes, to take their money, this stuff, and to take them out of meditation. So there was a surgeon and his families from the local hospital. And I'm telling the surgeon what to do. Please take off your shoes. Now we'll close our eyes. Now we'll do this. Now, and they're doing exactly what I told them. And so it's like, I don't know, it's sort of like a heady kind of thing for a kid.
I can connect because I was 17 when I joined staff at Scientology, and it was the same thing. You know, adults are like, to you, and oh man, this is the bomb, right?
You got it. And when we learn these, like it's called checking, but when we learned these procedures, they were memorized verbatim down to the lilts at the end of sentences. Like how many seconds of a pause between words. I mean, it was all this very rote script. And so, but you become very accustomed to doing it. You do it. So from there, I ended up going to the Maharishi University. I was there for 5 years, and it's an accredited university through the PhD level. So 95%, 90% of it is good academics. They had a unique style of teaching that they taught one course at a time. So physics was for a month, math was for a month, chemistry was for a month, and you went to school 6 days a week, like from maybe 9 o'clock in the morning to 3:30, 4 o'clock every day, and then evening groups. And they were able to bring in faculty from major universities. So my physics professor came from CERN in Switzerland. The government professor came from, he was head of economic development for the Caribbean. My marketing professor was head of marketing at Harvard. So they could bring these people in because they were only going to be there for a month to teach the discipline. And then there was 10% Maharishi crazy stuff. And so, you know, I really absorbed this Maharishi crazy stuff. My father saved all the letters that I wrote to him. And when he died, they were all there waiting for me. And oh my God, I mean, it's like, you know, the things I was telling him about the nature of the universe and how everything worked. So I went to the school. We learned to levitate to save the world. We were, you know, heavily involved. Became an associate teacher. And then when I graduated, I moved to Philadelphia to be part of a community to transform a very marginal area. So people were being sent into war zones in Nicaragua, Mozambique, Iran, Lebanon to stop wars. So they would rent hotel, like big ballrooms covered with foam rubber. And then these people would go in and then they would be doing this TM flying to stop the wars. So they believed it enough that that's what was going on.
Just so 1 second there. You mentioned TM flying.
Yes.
What? I thought this was just meditation.
So in the TM comes from the yoga system, and in the yoga system from the Yoga Sutras, there in chapter 3 of the Yoga Sutras, Patanjali, the author of the Yoga Sutras, identifies numerous siddhis. Siddhi means perfection, S-I-D-H-I, that one can attain.
Okay.
And so that's like supernatural friendliness, being able to fix your body and navigate the universe, gaining the strength of an elephant, all kinds of things, and the ability to levitate, because of visible, talk to animals, you know, all the basics of life, omniscience. And so it sounds crazy, but when Maharishi announced that these abilities were available, the people who came to the university to tell us about them were like the lieutenant governor of Pennsylvania was a flyer. You know, these were not like slouches. And they said they just got off their advanced course. Maybe it was a year-long course, and that they could levitate. And of course, you want to see people levitate. And then they'd say, well, no, you should learn it and experience it yourself. Otherwise, then there would be some doubt about what's happening, that it was a circus or any of that. We don't want any of that kind of stuff. So you had to learn the technique.
Wow.
And so I could go into the details of that. You know, it's interesting to me, but maybe not to everyone. So
Sure.
we did this advanced program. So I moved into Philadelphia. I'm part of this community to save the world, to transform communities. So if we can stop a war, we can transform a place. So my friends and I bought a bunch of houses up on a dead end street. I spent the most. I have to admit, it was $7,900 from my house. Most of them were a dollar. It was not good.
Wow.
So when I was at the university and I would come home, my father would set aside about 3 days to let me talk. I would dump. I'm explaining to him, this is, a high-ranking military guy, about how the universe works, and, in great detail, because I would be bringing going for the sale, to bring my father that he should learn to meditate. So my siblings learned, my mother learned, but not that. So, but it would come time. I remember one time I was talking to him, and I said, Dad, Jesus said to his disciples that he walked on water, and he said, you'll do this and more. And this is the more. Wouldn't you want to be able to levitate? I mean, you don't have to believe that people could levitate, but if they could, wouldn't you want to do that? And my father would say, son, what you found in life, you found something that makes you happy. And what makes me happy is riding horses, because I think seeing a sight of a horse is something that's good for a man's soul. So if I had 5 extra minutes of my life day, I would ride a horse. And because that's what makes me happy. And I'm happy you found out what's happy, makes you happy. So he never made me wrong for what I was doing. He found ways to try to not do that.
Right.
But I knew exactly what he thought, because he was my father. So, when he would come visit me at the university and there was, all this guru stuff around, I'm like helping clean it up. I'm thinking, what will my father think? Oh my God. So because he's in my head. So he doesn't have to say anything. He's leaking. I know what he thinks about everything. Not everything, but about everything. He was very straightforward. I knew. So he just knew. He didn't need to do that. And he tried to, relate to it. He told me he read Hubbard's book on a ship, Dianetics. So I'm in Philadelphia. I get a phone call from my father, and he said, Pat, he didn't call me Pat. He called me Irish or the Wild Man. That's the only 2 words he called me. So the Wild Man, you have to come home to Florida to talk to your sister, because she's joined a goddamn cult. And I'm like, oh, Dad, I know. I've talked to her on the phone, and she's a crazy Christian. Your son is an outstanding Hindu. She says, in that case, I have no desire to talk to her. And he said, look, I've supported you in every endeavor you've had in your life. I want you to come home and talk to your sister. She has cut every one of us off. Anyone who brings up anything negative, she's cut off. And I have 3 grandchildren. And they're going to end up going to Ohio to the Way Internationalist group, and they're going to be beaten because they do this kind of discipline of children. And I do not want my grandchildren that to happen. So I'm asking you again, come home and talk to your sister. So I'm like, he said, so there's some books I've read. Here's a phone number. So I called this woman in Philadelphia, Lois Patton, who had been a member of that. She was part of something called the Cult Awareness Network at that time. And she gave me some background. And when I flew to Florida, my father had a bunch of books for me to read. He said, not thick books, just paperbacks. And he said, there's some criticisms of the Maharishi and team in it. So I've drawn lines through those chapters because we don't agree with that. What I'd like you to do is just read about the way. So, of course, I read what he had said not to read at that perspective. And ultimately, I convinced my sister to come back to Philadelphia to meet with this woman that had been a high-ranking member. So there's a lot of detail in how I got her to do this. It's nuance. So she agreed. She came back to Philadelphia. This woman that I'd only known on the phone came to my door, knocked, and I'm giving her a hug. And she sat down, and over a 2 or 3 day period, she was talking to my sister about this Christian group and its unique understanding, and all the details, and how this guy's techniques are used, behavior modification, things that we would call about influenced kind of techniques.
Yeah.
And as she was talking to my sister, I was going, oh my gosh, that's what happened to me. And so as the days went on, because it was focused on Christianity and my sister, not on me, it was I could hear it. If they'd been focused on me, I wouldn't have budged. I was like, I knew this stuff inside and out. So my first intervention occurred when I was in a group.
And that is hilarious to me. And also, I have to say, we have said many times one of the ways you talk to cult members is you talk to them about other cults. You don't talk to them about theirs because they've got all the defenses up, right?
We call it third
I did
party.
not even like this is just the perfect story. This is amazing.
Well, we call it third party processing. So what it did was I allowed myself to ask questions, not to other people, but within myself.
Yeah.
That's what it gave me permission to do. So after that, and that was probably around a March of a year. And I then went off on a course in Iowa with 7,000 people, the Taste of Utopia, levitating with this large group of people. And people were saying, Pat, like, what are you doing? I said, well, I have an import company, but I really am a cultural deprogrammer. And I was like totally into this deprogramming business, but I was into TM. But when I was there, Maharishi was there, and all of a sudden it just lost its vibrancy, its sparkle. It seemed kind of. So then I began
the luster
asking.
had faded, so to speak.
It did, and so I began asking other people that I knew who had been faculty members who were no longer associated with the movement. I sought them out. Like, why did you leave? The movement had, like, if somebody was like not Herbert Benson, I forgot one of the guy who wrote the book, Harold Bloomfield. When he took they took all his books out of the library and the bookstore and threw them in the dumpster. So you would just be rewrite people's history. They didn't exist. So I sought out some of these people, and I found a whole new understanding. And so there's one of the things that Maharishi talked about, and is that the CIA was infiltrating the TM movement, and I knew that there were people that were CIA agents. We were told, and so I ended up talking to one of Maharishi's closest aides, and he said, "Yeah, for many years I knew about the CIA agents until the day Maharishi looked at me and he said, 'You are a CIA agent. Go back and report to your people.'" And he said, and then I realized those other people. I don't work for the CIA. He has a honey farm. He said, I know too much, and everybody else who knew too much, it was very easy. So no one wants to talk to the CIA agent. So he discredited people in a very clever way. And so I started, coming to a different understanding of TM. And then I really decided it was not what I thought it was. I then brought litigation against the TM movement and Maharishi in federal court in Washington for fraud and negligence and the intentional infliction of emotional distress. So we're going up against a corporation that probably spent $60 million defending it. And all I wanted was $1,407 back for the flying, because no one really flies. And they said, no, they wouldn't give it back. And I was really pissed off. I was young, full of testosterone and angry. So I'm picketing at their centers. I'm picketing all over the world because I'd been doing cult interventions. And so I might be in Australia and I would go picket at the center there. The next time I'm in London, I'm picketing there. And they're like, how is this guy, doing this? So my history of intervention started when I was in a group. The approach that I, ultimately sort of coalesced around is very similar to what happened to me, not to be confrontational. Right. To create an environment where people can learn things without them being defensive.
That's awesome. When was that you did that first? 83 with your sister?
Yes.
Okay. March. So would it be safe to say that was at a beginning, middle point of the cult deprogramming movement, if we'll call it that?
Oh yeah, it was the cult deprogramming movement at that time was deprogramming, kidnapping people off the street, throwing them into camps, and doing that. And I'm like, I went to a Cult Awareness Network conference, and there was the deprogrammers meeting, and I don't know, there must have been 50 people in this room. They're all the programmers, they're all kidnappers. And I'm
Yeah,
like,
Ted Patrick and the
he
like.
was not. I saw him once in my whole career, and that was
Okay.
in Portland, Oregon. And he was sitting with talking to Margaret Singer and trying to explain to her what happens to people in cults. And he said, you look them in the eyes, and that's how they get them. And she's going, I don't think exactly that way. So, oh, no, that's what happened. It was an interesting dialogue. But there was a few people, a guy named Kevin Garvey, that thought that you could basically, for most people, do some type of intervention without doing something illegal or harmful, like kidnapping them.
Right.
But
So you
the
never fell into that.
Not really.
That
I
whole
went.
dark side.
There was some connections to frequently what would happen for some of us is that somebody might do an intervention. Kidnap somebody, be in the middle of an intervention. The person was at the point where they were willing to talk to somebody else, and then they would say, "Would you come talk to the person?" And I would say, "Do you want to talk to me?" But there was just a few of those because I remember my partner Joe Kelly was on a case like that, and it was a kid that had been kidnapped off the streets of Philadelphia, thrown into a van. He defecated in himself. He was so afraid. Taken to the eastern shore of Maryland to this house where a star owned. And they had gone through the program after program. So the first person bailed after 10 days. The person who had kidnapped them in this horrible way, duct taping him. He's like, his family wasn't even in the van. I mean, it was just like strangers off the street throwing him into a van.
Oh my God.
Terrified. So somebody called Joe and said, would you come down and help us? And this guy would like to talk. He's willing to talk. And Joe had no idea that he had been kidnapped. And so
Right.
Joe went up to the second floor to sit and talk to the guy. And he said, what's going on? How'd you get here? And he said, and he told him the story. And he said, well, then I'm taking you home. Yeah. So Joe walked down. The father was a general, had been a general, like a Colin Powell type guy. And he said, I'm taking him home. What you've done to him is horrible. And the mother freaked out. But Joe loaded him up in the car. Because he said to Joe, no matter what they say about this group I was in, or is true or not, I will never give them the satisfaction because of what they did to me.
Exactly. I've kind of summarized that whole thing as you're not going to get somebody out of a cult by acting like cult members. That's what cult members do to people. You can't reverse that by doing more of it.
Well, there was a belief at the time that people had this sudden personality change and they snapped, and you could get them to snap out. I have very strong opinions on that subject. But so Joe said to him, "I'm going to take you back," and then he was able to talk to him because he was driving him back, and they had whole conversations, and he met with them numerous times afterwards because he liked Joe. Joe was his savior, and he ended up leaving the group. Because he was a savior from a horrible, horrible situation. So, that was the world that existed. And, I look, it's horrible in many ways, but parents didn't know what to do.
Nope.
Their kids disappeared, they cut off, and I think it was a folio due. Some of the groups were more open, and then parents were convincing their kids to leave, and then so the groups got tight, and then this thing goes back and forth, and then people start kidnapping, and it had its work. Well,
yeah.
So at the programmers meeting, there was a few of us were saying, look, there are probably people that's what you're going to do, but there's most of these people you don't need to do that. I went to school with a young woman, still a friend of mine, her name is Bev, who was a student at Maharishi International University, and she was kidnapped. And she didn't need to be kidnapped. First of all she had to do is tell the university they didn't want her there, and they would have kicked her out. So, that was because they didn't want negative publicity. I said, And not only did that happen, but she was raped on her intervention because the
Oh,
deprogrammers thought that she was a virgin, and that to prove that she was out, she needed to lose her virginity.
ah,
So I
ugh,
knew that this was, I couldn't make comments upon people that other things, but the people that I knew that it's happened to, I could comment upon that.
right.
And I just didn't think it was, you know, the way to go, the approach.
Right.
And that evolved over time from this kidnapping world to something called exit counseling, which was kind of, I mean, these are arbitrary names, that some of us have come together who were trying to make distinctions between the past, being kidnapped, and what was happening. So we
Right.
made this distinction that a voluntary process, that no one was held against their will. They certainly could leave at any time they wanted, but it was still to bring about an emotional change. And
Right.
then this guy, Kevin Garvey, started more focusing on an intellectual approach, trying to stimulate someone's intellect, which was the idea that the only thing that's going to keep somebody out of a group is their own intellect, their own self. And he created a kind of approach which was much more of a salon, like a French salon. So 5 or 6 of us would come, we'd go around, we'd sit around, we'd talk philosophy and ideas, we'd engage the person, we'd talk to each other. It was a salon. And then Kevin, who went to Columbia, he would give some philosophical treatise on something. And most of the people would reevaluate their involvement. But it was just giving them the tools. Not this, you were in a bad group. I felt no need to convince them they were in a cult. They were in a situation that wasn't healthy, whatever they want to call it, I don't care. Can we help them leave? So that evolved. And then we started trying to make another distinction. We created an ethical guidelines for what we call thought reform consultants. And that's where people who follow these particular guidelines, there would be
Yes.
no, I mean, there was even things detailed in it, like who is the client? So if a family hires us, they're our client, right? And then, but when we meet the person who's in the group, they're our client. And where does our ethics say if the person who's in the group that we're talking to tells us things, we they're our client now. We don't have to tell the family. I mean, we were trying to really hammer out the details of ethics surrounding this. And then it evolved again and to more of what happened to me. And that is creating an environment where someone could learn information respectfully. And most situations resolve themselves. So there was an idea that when people joined, they were gone for a lifetime. And Michael Langoni's research, if you couple it together, indicate probably 90% of the people who join these groups leave them on their own. It's just a matter of when. Not good
Right.
predictors. Not good predictors of after a week or after 50 years, but most people leave them.
Right.
And so, if
Right.
we know that most people leave, can we create an environment that's healthy for them to come back to? So, do you want to? I mean, do you want to go to someone's house for dinner where everybody's bitching at each other, or not nice and are attacking you? So, could we create a safe place in the family system or someplace which had an easy glide path for them to come back, that was respectful, that didn't make the person wrong for the decisions, that was nurturing, that met all the sort of criteria for the determinants of positive mental health: job, respect, health insurance, respect for their diversity. So we try to create those types of environments before we would interfere with someone's life. Because I don't think it's right to interfere with someone's life and then say, then what? You're going to go back to a family that's filled with fighting? No.
Right.
I'll close this with saying, in the main, group involvement, in my opinion, just my opinion, is a quality of life issue. It is not life and death. That doesn't mean there's not life and death issues. There's Jonestown, there's Heaven's Gate, but that's a very small percentage of the tragedies of group involvement.
Right.
And if you impose that upon all shades of group involvement, you're going to get families who are very upset.
Yeah.
They're going to maybe possibly do things that they wouldn't normally do. And so if you approach it from the point of view that this is a quality of life issue, can we improve someone's quality of life? Then that sort of informed more the way I think. I don't know if
Well,
that's long-winded.
yeah. No, thank you for all of that, because it really does contribute to the whole answer. And it makes me think that people join these groups or get involved with these groups. And Ashton and I spoke about this a bit a couple of weeks ago, that I in my limited, very limited experience with this, I have found very dysfunctional families that these people are coming out of, and the cult is presenting itself to the person as the opposite of that. That's one of the reasons it has so much appeal. Is this is a functional group where we love each other and work together, and we're all on the same page, and you're coming out of a system that is the exact opposite. That it's chaotic, it's hostile, it's unfriendly at best. So really what you're kind of proposing or talking about here is sort of the antidote to the fake family of the cult, because let's face it, we are talking about destructive groups that use insidious means. And so they might run to such a group because it solves problems for them, but eventually those same problems become even bigger.
For
And so
some,
now you're presenting a much more rational alternative.
well, for some people, look, genuine relationships are formed in groups too. So my partner, Joe Kelly, he has two friends that he has known for 50 years from when he was in TM, and they go out and have dinner every month, and they've always had dinner every month, in, out. They were high ranking members.
Right.
They're friends. So
Right.
there are genuine relationships. And then there were other people. I remember being on a flight, and we were on a flight, and these people walked by as they were boarding, and they looked at Joe and said, we sort of had a funeral for you. We just assumed you're dead," and walked on. I mean, and there's that. So
Right.
both are true.
Right.
When you talk about why people join groups, obviously there's models that say there's influence and control, and I believe that that's true in many cases. But I worked with a guy in Australia, and it was interesting because he had aphantasia, which is the inability to conjure up images in your brain. So I have it. So I don't see visual things in my head. And he joined this guru group for one reason, because they promised him he would be able to see things. They would open his third eye, and he would be able to have imagination. That's why, and he didn't care if the guru was, doing horrendous things, because that's what he wanted. And when he was there for a couple of years and didn't get what he wanted, his third eye opened or not open, he didn't see pictures in his head, so he left. So people join for many, many different reasons, and I think that we've got to be careful to ascertain why a individual is joining and not impose a model upon them.
Absolutely. I have preached for many years, something that was actually a lesson that was influenced by you, which is that context always matters. Always, always, always. There is no blanket assembly line process here. There are guidelines, there's ethical rules, of course, but you have to deal with the person in front of you. There is no blanket anything. And if you're thinking or dealing in stereotypes with somebody, they're gonna reject what you're saying, because you ain't talking about them. You're talking about some model you have. And that's why I have said for a long time, models are useful. Again, actually kind of something I learned from you. Models are useful, but models are a dime a dozen. There's model schmodel, there's hundreds of them. What's applicable to the person in front of you is what really matters.
What elements of what models? You could take elements. You could lift in, for example, you could take thought terminating cliches. You could then take something from Cialdini's work on influence and talk about reciprocity. You could take something from another model. So if you can cobble together different techniques of how influence takes place and show it to a person that matches their experience, then it makes sense. I was thinking about what we brought up about the deprogramming. Joe and I worked on a case one time with a young woman who joined the Hare Krishnas. Her family was freaked out. And there was a former member who came along with us at that time that I'd never met. And she had been deprogrammed out of the Hare Krishnas. And her deprogramming was rather extreme.
Mm.
And so when we were talking with this young woman who was, exploring the Krishnas at the time, we were having great dialogue. We were, it was very open and meaningful to her. And the young woman who had been deprogrammed said, nothing that you're telling her is what I heard. And I said, well, what did you hear? She said, I must have been so brainwashed for what my parents did. And I said, well, what did they do? And she said to me and to Joe, well, they kidnapped me. And then this man came into the room in a kilt, turned on the stereo with Rod Stewart, Do You Think I'm Sexy? Full blast, and screamed for about a half hour, fuck me, Krishna, fuck me. And that was to get her attention. That was to get her attention. And so she said, and then it was, it went downhill from there. So she said, wow. Nothing of what you're saying did I hear. I just heard all of this other stuff. And so she was justifying what had happened to her because she was so brainwashed. And those are another world. There could be people like that. There could be people out of their mind, from a group or a guru or just taking over their lives. I'm not talking about that. There can be those life and death issues. But this young woman certainly didn't need to be thrown in the back of a van, brought into a house, have somebody screaming at her and profanities to get her attention, then go on about the horrendous acts of the Krishnas. It's just a little bit of an oversell of the product. And
for sure.
And so I think that our approach is probably successful because we're not that. Because we are, and it appears we're respectful and we like to talk about ideas and we want to explore things with someone to the degree to which they want to explore. And if we can get their interest, then they'll want to explore it more. But it's certainly not imposing anything on anyone. So groups prepare people, some groups do, Scientology, for what the deprogrammers are going to do. This is what they behave like. The Scientologists have the deprogrammers manual that they created. If you're familiar, in Australia. So they wanted to discredit deprogramming. So they created an organization in Australia, I forgot its name, and to distribute this booklet on deprogramming called the Deprogrammers Manual. So they create an organization. The organization meets with families. They then give the Deprogrammers Manual of how you deprogram people. Now the press can see what the deprogrammers do, which is to keep people up, strip them naked, criticize their genitals, put ice on them. Doing all kinds of things. So when someone thinks that's what you're going to do, and you come in and you're just like, want to go for a walk, we want to talk. I'm exaggerating a bit here. It's just not what they expect, and so we can take advantage of the abuses of the past to be able to have a respectful dialogue. And
that makes sense.
People who've written a lot of books on the subject, what they describe in the books, also many groups are prepared for it. So you just want to be honest with someone and be respectful and show them, look, if you're not curious yourself about the subject. I remember visiting a group with a cult apologist. And this one cult apologist said to me from Canada, visiting this group was like part of a sort of a team of people, sociologists, and people who attended a conference. It was an opportunity to go visit the group. And I remember being in the car with the person or a bus and saying, like, how do you choose what you work with? I said, well, I only work with things I'm interested in. If I'm not interested in the subject, I'm not going to be effective. And it just blew her away that, you have to be interested? I said, yes, I have to know what I'm talking about. It's not like, just because this has happened, it has to be real. And if you're not curious about it, the subject, then it's very hard to read as being curious, or, if you can't see the beauty in it, because groups have a sort of, Joseph Bart uses this idea of aesthetic. They have an aesthetic, they have a beauty, they have a symmetry. They often deal with death, birth, old age. There's something that someone loves about it. And if you just come in and saying everything you love is horrible, that's not a way to go. But can you find the areas where you can understand how they love? So I kind of believe that if you can appreciate what someone appreciates about something, then you have the right to criticize it. But if you don't appreciate what they love about it, not so much. And so the example we often use is art. I don't have any art around I can show you. If you look at a painting in my house and you came over the first time and said, "That's ugly. Why do you have that in your living room?" Well, things probably not going to go too well. But if you looked at the art and go, "Hey, that's very interesting composition. There's these pigeons. They seem to be large. This strokes a thing. But why did the person put this?" If you can appreciate what I appreciate, then you can criticize the art. But if you start off the other way, so I think we look at this as art.
I get that. I get that because it's, I was listening to a philosopher the other day, a completely unrelated topic, who's just talking about philosophy and how philosophers talk to one another and how, they're just as human as anybody else. And so there's a trap that you can fall into in that field specifically. He was saying, which is, that you're going to approach this topic as though there's a bucket of true things and a bucket of false things. And you're going to sort Nietzsche or Plato or Aristotle into these two buckets. And he said, this is exactly the wrong, you're going to fail miserably at philosophy. Yes. If this is how you're approaching it, because it's about process and it's about understanding processes and appreciating processes of how you think, how you get there. You can get to wrong answers and still appreciate the way the person got there, and maybe disagree with their conclusions and still appreciate the process by which they did it.
Like that.
And I think what you're saying here is along the same lines, where it's that part of it that you're really exploring with the person, not fighting their conclusions. And, because that's how to take their head and bang it against a wall. And you're wrong, and you're wrong, and you're wrong. Instead of, well, I'm very, very curious why you think this is true, or what appeal this has to you, or what was it about this that you found so attractive and continue to find attractive. Then you're getting into process and their thinking and their emotional life, not all their wrong answers that are just so wrong, and you're such an idiot for thinking that. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I do agree with it. If you can, maybe in some way, it's a little arrogant, I think, to say it, but if you could elevate someone's understanding of something, make it a little bit more sophisticated understanding. Yeah. So you have to sort of understand how they see it to bring them to the point, or help them, or guide them, or point them in the direction of a more expanded view of the subject. It doesn't mean that maybe the more constrained view is not accurate, but there's another view, and I think that's what we try to do. But I want to emphasize, you talked about Ashland last week. So there's very few people in my career that I've met that had that curiosity and that interest that I thought could do this. And when I met Ashland, from the moment I met her, I thought, she can do this. She has a curiosity about the ideas. She has a love for people. She's interested. She knows how to be respectful. And people are drawn to that. And she's able to have very difficult conversations with people that other people would not be able to have.
It's a skill. It's a skill, for sure, because you have to drop a lot of your self-importance, and you have to drop a lot of your conclusions and be super interested in the person in front of you, instead of trying to assert, some kind of dominance, or some kind of like, no, let me tell you about why you're wrong. That's just not going to get as far, right?
You're totally right. I just want to add or emphasize, but you have to be interested.
Yeah.
I mean, you got to be the kind of person who's curious about ideas.
That's
And
right.
I think that, like Justin Hart, very curious about ideas, interested
Yes.
in exploring ideas. John Atack, curious about ideas. There are people that just inherently have a curiosity about life and understand that their ideas maybe are not fixed. They may change over time, but they're never disrespectful of other people's conclusions.
Right.
And that reads to someone, and it reads that you're not imposing.
Right.
I,
Right. This is actually the exact point that I've tried to make over and over again with people. There's this process or this thing out there called street epistemology, which is really just kind of questioning about people's beliefs, right? To try to understand how they come to their conclusions. And yet there are people who will use this in a way to try to, dominate or beat somebody up because they don't agree with their ideas. And so you're wrong, and God doesn't exist, and I'm going to like show you why that is. And that's not that's just I've always like bristled at that approach, using that, right? Because no technique is going to be superior to, I think, what the point you're making, which is that curiosity, that spark of, I really, really want to understand this person in front of me.
yeah,
And it really is kind of a more of a elevated philosophical, if you will, approach. And it's one that a lot of people in the world these days, it seems, struggle with. We seem to be in a very binary culture, a very divided
yes, yeah.
culture right now, and people seem to crave the good bucket, the right bucket, and the bad bucket, right? You're wrong or you're right. And these nuances, these shades of gray seem to collapse, in that way of thinking.
While you were talking, I was thinking about my sister
Mm,
randomly, and Ashlyn and Joe Kelly, because when my sister and I are very close and we go places, and she'll say, "We need Joe here," or "We need Ashlyn here," because they'll find out everything. And I'm like, "You're right." We were just in Texas, the three of us, and by the time we took an Uber, I don't know, 15 minutes, by the time we're done with the Uber, Ashley and Joe told me this person's entire life. Where they came from, why they came from, how many kids they had. It was like, how did you get all of this sitting in the front seat, talking to this person in a 15-minute ride? They were interested.
yeah,
And the person opened up and talked to them about their lives. And they always showed respect.
yeah.
And fundamentally, I think that's what most people want, is they want to be respected.
I think
And
you're
because we
absolutely
all
right.
believe crazy shit, right? We
That's
all
right.
believe all crazy stuff. When
Well, we're
families,
human. How could we
yeah,
not? You
when
know?
I dealt with families that think that, I mean, let's say the OT3 story is crazy. How can my child believe that? And then I sit back and sometimes I think, well, there was God, and then God decided that somehow people have done something wrong, and his son was there, and they put him on a cross, and then somehow by being on the cross, he solved the problem, and he rose from the dead. Now, it's a meaningful story for many people. I'm not criticizing Christianity, but it's not logical either.
It is not. It is
It's
not.
not.
And nor are any of the, I mean, Islam, I mean, all of it has logic holes that you could drive a Mack truck through, but that's not really the purpose it serves for people. And we
No.
get that, right? We get
Yeah.
that.
I think that
Um,
you're very important what you just said. It's not the purpose it serves for people. Different things serve different purposes for different people,
that's
and
right.
religion is in that category. And so,
That's
criticizing
right.
somebody because they believe in the OT3 story, I don't think is a great place to start.
No, exactly. No, and you can't lead with that stuff. You gotta lead with finding out about the person in front of you. And I think that this and one of the little not so hidden agendas I have with my channel and this show and talking with people like you is because I want people to understand that social media and all the divisiveness and crazy riled up emotions that are our daily life now, if we're being honest, right? If you turn on the TV or you go on YouTube or whatever, this is what our world is surrounded with. And yet when you go home, when you go out, when you're meeting with your friends, meeting with people, it's so different from that.
Yes.
Right? It's such a different life itself is such a different experience from what I really think of as anti-social media. You know, that's corrosive stuff. That's stuff that encourages people to insult one another, to talk down to each other. I fall prey to it. You know, I get frustrated with things I see and things I hear, or bad people doing bad things. And yes, those exist in the world, and sometimes they rise to the level of our governments, and it happens. You know, that's a
Yeah.
real thing. You know, there are some people who simply won't engage, don't want to engage, have other agendas. You know, we're not going to go do an intervention on David Miscavige. That would be a very, very challenging thing to do, as opposed to your run-of-the-mill Scientologist, you know, because there's a whole different agenda going on there.
Brent
So,
Preacher.
well, yeah. So my point, of course, is that at holiday meals, at, you know, when you're getting together with your friends and your family, and these points of contention come up, these pieces of advice about how to go deal with someone who's in a cult
Are the
have
same.
so much applicability. It's the same stuff. It's being human to one another, and it is hard. I will be the first to admit it's hard sometimes.
USC, University of Southern California, had a diplomacy department at one time. I don't know if they still do. They had a website on diplomacy, which I linked a lot to. It's not there anymore, that part. And I think that a lot of what we're talking about is diplomacy. And I think that you can learn a lot from diplomacy. I have a friend who's an English Benedictine monk, a Catholic monk. And we were giving a workshop in Washington, and I asked him, he's also a social worker, so I asked him if he would participate as a mental health professional, not as a priest. And so, you know, he agreed. And so we were, I don't know, 30, 40, 50 people in the room. And it got a little odd. People weren't understanding certain concepts. And so he stopped. He said, you know, I do interfaith dialogue for the Vatican with different new religious movements. And I do it help with Islam. And I thought, where's he going with this? You know, we're here to talk about it. And he said, so he asked the group, he said, if you thought about it, if you were going to do interfaith dialogue with imams about Islam, and you're a Catholic, where would you start? And I had absolutely no idea what he was talking about or where he was going. And then he said, "You'd start with the Virgin Mary." Now I really didn't know where he was going. And then he told the story that when Muhammad had his vision, and he was against any iconography, any symbolism, pictures of God, you know, that was going to be removed. And he went around. They went around, him and his brother, cutting off crosses and removing the icons out of the churches. One icon. His brother was in a church, and there was one icon of Mary holding the infant Jesus, and he said that one can stay. And so he said that's where we start. We start where we agree, and then we can explore all the things that we agree, and then we can look at things that maybe we see things differently. But we always start with where we can agree.
I'm just going to say fucking genius, because that's exactly what I think too. And I could not agree more. If you can't find common ground, I mean, sometimes you got to dig. Sometimes that common ground is 5 feet down, right? But even if it's just we're human, I mean, and build from there. I mean, I'm telling you, this is a vital point in how, if you're going to go on an agenda of changing someone's mind, that's not where to start. You know,
Look, you can
back.
Just being, you know, we live in a very politically divided country, as is presented by media and social media. So you have this dichotomy of viewpoints, and neither side deals well with people that are somewhere have nuanced views about certain subjects.
Yeah.
I have a different view on guns than most people that are of my political persuasion. And that is because I grew up with them from when I was a kid. They're a very useful tool in South Dakota. Or, we got paid 5 cents a gopher that we shot when we're 6 years old. It's just a very different relationship with that. And the idea that you would tell somebody in South Dakota that they can't give their kid a gun without going 30 miles to a courtroom to register the gun, it's just not going to jive with them because it's a different world they come from. And I understand that world. But I also understand where I live in Philadelphia, that you'd want someone to register the gun. Both are true.
Yes.
Both are true.
Yes.
So unless we understand that viewpoint of the other people, then we're in these silos, and we're not going to see in gun control or any of those. We're not going to understand
That's right.
why the things are the way they are. So when you can confound these people, because it's very confusing to people when someone who is maybe more liberal is advocating for something that a conservative person might be advocating for.
That's right.
I think that we can all model nuance. We can confound systems of silos by just not delivering what those silos are perpetuating. And it requires us to really look at ourselves and what we believe and accept that people have views that are views not because they're bad, mean people. They have views because that's what they've come to. And if we come in thinking that they're just bad people for holding those views, probably not going to go very far. And that's the world we seem to be seeing when we open social media. It just perpetuates silos, and it doesn't move people toward nuance.
That's right. That's right. It's a fake world, really, the social media world. It's a faux shadow of reality. It's extreme ideas, extreme thoughts. I got to get this out. But if you were to sit the person down and go, is this really what you think? They'd be like, wow, I don't know. And I'm not saying that's everybody, but
No. There's a continuum. In my worldview, it's not a place where you have academic discussion and academic debate. So when I see PhDs on social media arguing academic ideas, I'm thinking, this is not the venue for those ideas. Scholarly journals are the venues for that. There's a place where that has a thing, but it's not social media.
That's right.
I think that we can bring people along. I know that, I participate in social media. We have our news channel, but I also in that put up articles, and I put up an article a couple of days ago about this. The Mormon Church, the LDS, has acknowledged some writings from the late 1800s by one of their prophets who advocated polygamy for a lifetime. And
I saw that.
Yeah, well, there's a number of comments about this is horrible. Why are you doing that? And somebody wrote and said, this is exactly what I expect to see on here. I expect to see different opinions and so, I come from the world, I think, I worked for the International Catholic Studies Association for 23 years in the past, that the people's ideas that exist, if we don't engage them and we don't know what they are, we don't know what their arguments are, then we're stuck in our silos. So engaging with people that we disagree with so that we can understand them makes us a much better consumer of information and puts us in a position where we can talk with people about very difficult things. And so learning what other people think about things, I think, is important. And so on our news channel, I have stuff from cult apologists, so to speak, from groups. I should be all kinds of viewpoints, because if my kid is involved in something that I dislike strongly, I want to know what they believe.
That's right.
I don't want to know what the critics say about them. I want to know what they believe so that I can then have a meaningful dialogue with my son.
Exactly. And that's a really important point you just mentioned, because it's not necessarily what's in the books. People have their own interpretations, own ideas of what this stuff means. And it might
Yes.
surprise you to find how different those understandings can be from what the guru is apparently saying or writing, or what the group preaches. Sometimes people can have wildly different ideas. We were talking, just because I have a pretty Scientology familiar audience, so I think they'll appreciate this. We were talking before about, you had known a guy who got all the way up to OT8 and had really, in his own mind, thought of it as metaphor. And I, a couple of years ago would have thought that was absolutely impossible, because my experience with Scientology was literal understanding. It's the absolute truth, and this is how it is. And that's and Xenu is historical fact. There ain't no metaphor. I even answered questions that way years ago about that topic. And now I have a much more nuanced understanding of it, because of seen and heard so much more from ex-members about how their experience of the OT levels or of Scientology was vastly different from mine, or my understanding of it. So that nuance point is absolutely vital.
Well, I mean, and Scientology is set up so that no one would tell you that that's their understanding, because they can't share that they
That's
have such
right.
different variety.
That's
The only
right.
person who probably knows the variety is the auditor, a high-ranking auditor who's spoke with 50 people who were Ben Franklin. I mean, they can't invalidate any of them. They can't decide which one was Ben Franklin. They're going to have to come up with their own little cognitive way
That's
of doing
right.
it. Oh,
That's right.
split souls or something. I mean, so I think that maybe a high-ranking auditor might be able to deliver or know the varieties of the experience.
That's right. That's exactly right. Hey, let me ask you some nuts and bolts kind of questions, because I want to give people as much empowerment and tools as possible, right? I mean, you've got literally decades of experience working with people. Sometimes people you're just meeting for the first time when you walk in the room. Sometimes there's some prep, but you're dealing with people who are pretty routinely could be described as people of extreme belief, extreme faith, right? People who are really doubling, tripling, quadrupling down on ideas that most people would think of as absolutely ludicrous, and are basing their, sometimes basing, like I was as a Sea Org member, their whole life around it. And you have succeeded many, 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 many times in, and we're not going to get into statistics and numbers, because that's not what this is about. Ashlyn and I, we already had that discussion. So you've dealt with that for literally decades, right? So when do you, first off, again, I know it's going to be a little individual for each person, but what's your basic approach in terms of introducing yourself, or how to get into a discussion with someone? And how do you know when it's going well versus how do you know when maybe it's time to pull back and leave this alone?
Well, first of all, what I think is well and what someone who may hire me thinks is well are two different things often. So a family's desire could be the person, is so far out of the group that they have no connection and they want to sue the person. Another family, they're only what they really want is that they can have a relationship with their child, that they can see them 3 times a year.
Right.
So there's all kinds of things that people want. And so it's difficult to answer it, because there's so many variety of what people want. So one of the things we try to do is we spend a lot of time with families, lots of time, before we'd ever consider talking to somebody in a group. And that is to get them to what do they want, and to help them coalesce or refine their concerns that would be meaningful to their loved one. So much of it has to do with getting to know a family, getting to understand their concerns, getting to see how could they present the information that they have, that they're concerned about, to their loved one. So if we make a metaphorical or a composite case of a family that is very antagonistic to their loved one's involvement in something, and no matter what the family's siblings do, they can't reach the person. And then the family meets someone like myself or Ashlyn, and we can help the family understand and appreciate what their loved one loves about what they're involved in. Then we've done something that the person that they're concerned about hasn't been able to accomplish, and thus we're useful to them.
Mm-hmm.
So if I can, I'm using this just to illustrate, if I can get mom to stop criticizing group A and that their child has ruined their entire life and they're wasting whatever it is, and their communication with me has, if I've done that, then I want them to, let their loved one know, so they're talking to this guy, Pat, who's helped them understand and help them ask the appropriate questions. And these are not questions to get someone out, but the questions that show that you appreciate the system. So I believe that most groups have a protocol of recruitment, the ways in which you should recruit. So if you go to Scientology and you start saying Xenu to somebody, that you violated the protocols of recruitment. That's way down the lane. So there's a way in, and you should know certain things at certain times. And so if you understand the protocols of a particular system's recruitment, and you ask appropriate questions that indicate to the person that you have a genuine curiosity, then if I've helped you do that, and no one else your loved one hasn't been able to get you to do that, then I'm useful. And so most people know about someone like myself or Joe 6 months before we possibly even met, because I have the family tell them, you're talking to us and we're helping you, grasp these concepts. I have people read books on the particular philosophy to understand it, so that they ask respectful questions. Because I believe that most people that are in groups want to save their family's soul, so to speak. They want to save their parents' soul. Yeah. And so as long as you're recruitable, I don't mean that I want to join thing, just that you're not recruitable. you haven't gone out to, you're not recruitable. That you have an interest and you can understand, then they have a reason to talk to you. But if you're not recruitable, then it doesn't mean they won't talk to you, but they don't necessarily have the same motivation to do it. And I think that, most people that I meet know of us well before we ever talk to them.
That's interesting.
Because the family has changed. At least we're referenced that they're talking to people who've helped them understand. So, if mom, I'm going to just make this up. So if mom and dad are so anti-Scientology, and would not have a book by Hubbard in their house, and their son comes home and there's Dianetics next to their bed and they're reading it, well, that's interesting. How did that come about? Mm-hmm. Why are you reading that? So if I could get them to do that, then they've done something that their loved one couldn't do. Right. And show them respect. Years ago, I remember working with a family in Canada, and the dad was a diesel mechanic. And for all practical purposes, the son was like a PhD philosopher, not a PhD, but he was philosophically minded. He was in Scientology. Mm. And he tried to, get his father to read Dianetics. And this just was like not what the father was going to do. And for, probably just didn't have the wherewithal to get through it.
Sure.
So
it's not like it's an easy read.
No, it's not an easy read. So I think we spent 3 days teaching Dianetics, teaching the dad what the book meant. Wow. What you're understanding. What does your son understand? So that if we had a discussion with his son, he could show his son that he loved him enough to try to get his head around what his son believed. And so when we met the son another time, that he said, "How did you get my father to understand this? How did that happen?" I said, "Well, he wanted to communicate with you, and it was very hard for him to get through. And so maybe we didn't do it by going through misunderstood words, and I would say something like that, but we taught him what the essence of what's being trying to be communicated. And he said, when my father told me this is what he thinks, what Scientology is about, that in some way, I create my own bank, and I was blown away, and I started crying, and now I understand why my father's concerned. But it's teaching people it's not just not to be critical, but it's teaching people to what does a person, what is their thing, and what would you want? Well, if I was trying to recruit you into TM, I would want you to be curious about what I'm interested in.
That's right. That's right. And there's a real fundamental thing. I want to say this before I forget. Understanding a thing is a very, very different thing from agreeing with it.
Oh, big thing. Yes.
Really important point, right?
Because very important. Really fundamental.
We are circling around something that was written well over 150 years ago by John Stuart Mill in a paper called On Liberty, which is how to engage in discourse. You have to be able to explain the other person's argument back to them better than they can. Yes, and then you can engage with it. But if you can't do that, you have no business engaging with that argument because you don't understand what it is you disagree with. Now, he didn't say you don't have any business, but it was advice of, I added that emphasis, but it's the advice of understand the person you're talking to, Yeah.
If what you said is absolutely correct from my world, is that understanding does not mean agreement. Agreement does not mean that you're on board.
Right.
Just to understand something.
That's right. Have you ever run into people who are like, oh, no, because they were afraid that they might be converted or that could be a factor? Well, I don't want to know about that because I don't want to be no Scientologist, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. And they don't want to see that there's any good in it. And reality is, I believe that people would not have done Scientology if they didn't get some benefit. So certainly, this is a bias, but from people that I know that were long-term members, certainly in the lower areas of the bridge, people get some benefit. And
well, they wouldn't continue if they didn't.
They would continue. Unless you say that they're influenced so much, and there is that too.
There is that.
There is that, and there's the blackmail, and there's all that kind of stuff that comes out.
That's right.
We'll accept all that. But genuinely, people get something, and they may. I can go from here, Philadelphia to LA in a Volkswagen. I can go in a Mercedes. I can go in a Learjet. I still get to LA. It just maybe the ride is not as comfortable. And I think that if you have a problem with your mom and you go to Scientology and you do go through some lists and you unhook all the anger you have with your mom, well, that's where you got it. You can talk to a priest and you get it. You can talk to a therapist. Talk to me. It doesn't matter. You still don't have the anger maybe that you had with your parent.
Right. So that's right.
Yes, there are families that are afraid to give anything, there's any good.
Right. Well, when we lead with South Park and Xenu, then people, of course, are immediately ridiculing. And hey, I'm going to be the last person to tell you it's not ridiculous. Of course it is. But what he's saying is absolutely right. It's not ridiculous to the person who's in it.
No.
And you've got to get your head around that if you're going to talk to them about it.
Because we all have irrational beliefs. We all believe things that are just irrational, be it politically or in any venue. And so we're not that different.
That's right. When do you gauge out of again, I know I'm asking for average answers out of things that are highly individual, every single case, right? So we're talking broad strokes here, but when do you pull back? When do you realize, okay, this is someone who we've introduced some ideas, maybe we've had some conversations, but this now needs to, we're going to pull back from this now. What's the judgment factor on that?
When you lose, you're going to lose rapport.
I'm sorry, when you lose what?
When you're going to lose rapport.
Okay, it gets argumentative or difficult or angry or what does that look like? What do you mean?
you're losing the person. They don't want to continue the conversation. That
Ah,
you're doing an overrun. You know,
ah, got
so
it.
most of our interventions in the past 25 years are we might meet somebody at lunch for half hour. They might invite us back. About 80% of people ask us to come back to talk to their family, to help their family understand more, because they know for the last 6 months that their family's been changing their way that they perceive. They've been focusing on the things that they can agree on, not the things they disagree on. They're out of
Right.
this mindset that their kid is going to, they're in a cult, and it's a horrible thing. And it is for many people, but not all for everybody. Um, then, if the person has asked us and we're helping them, we're accomplishing what they want, they are usually one who drives this. They ask you to come back until they are no longer interested. Here's our phone number. You want to talk? You know, give us a
Right.
phone call. We're glad to chat with you. But there's a point, look, if you go into a bar and you sit down, you're having a drink, and there's somebody you're attracted to, and you start talking to them, and it's going along, and then you go for a sale, and it doesn't happen. When the sale is not happening.
That's right.
So meeting someone, when they see that you're interested and care, and that you genuinely want what's best for them, that you're not going to show them how wrong they are, or that you're showing their family how right they are, because there's a lot they're right about.
Yeah.
And look, some of the, it's a difficult thing to say. Some of the people I've met that are in groups are some of the best people I've ever met in my life, because they're people who care, and they care enough to change. They care.
Yeah.
They want the world a better place.
Yeah.
People generally don't. There are people who join groups for horrible reasons. Okay, there's 764. Children is a very bad thing. But in the main, people associate with groups or teachers or ideas because they want to become better, not because they want to become worse.
That's right.
And so those qualities that families instill of being idealistic or trying to achieve this thing, that's what's running a lot of their own scripts. And so maybe somebody or some group has usurped that, but still the desire is not to make the world a worse place. It's to improve people's lives. So you see people out there doing things, and it's not easy being in a group. That's I think a big misnomer. It's not always pleasant. It can be hell. I meditated in the 5 years I was at Maurice U. I spent 18 months on courses that were a month long and 3 months long. Your eyes were closed, about 20 hours a day, where you didn't go to the bathroom alone, watch TV, read newspaper, call home, write letters, where things were controlled down to seconds. And I literally mean, you have 15 seconds for this, you have 2 minutes for this. And when you're in that environment, it's intense. And sometimes it's blissful, and sometimes you hate it. Both are true.
That's right. I concur completely from my own experience in the Sea Org. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. Surprise, it's life, because that's what it is. Yeah. And if you had tried to abduct me, even in the middle of the RPF, the worst of worst times, I would have fought you,
Yeah.
I would have, because the prison was up here.
I agree. I was just reflecting on a particular case I worked on in Australia.
Mm.
And this lady, a mother in her 50s, had taken a course with a group of people who thought they were dolphins. And this woman decided she was a dolphin. And she had become an interdimensional light being, and had taken over her life. And she was no longer who she once was. Her name, she wasn't Mary anymore. She got off the plane from the US, and she was like Xantha. She was another person. And so we started trying to talk with her this years and years ago. And all she would say is, "It's not my next." So your family would really like to, have a discussion. Maybe we can explore some ideas. It's not my next. It's not my next. It's not my next. And after days of, trying to have a conversation with her in an open environment, she was, they said, okay. I mean, she's not going to talk. So we kind of packing up our things, and Joe Kelly was in Australia also on another situation, and he came down to Melbourne, where Josimar and I we were both there, and he came by because we were going to go to look at some theosophical center that was in Melbourne, that was lined with copper. It's obscure, but
Wow.
and so Joe walked in, and he just started talking to her. And an hour, half hour, 45 minutes, the woman was out of the group.
Wow.
She just wasn't going to give anybody the glory of doing it. But, Joe Kelly walks in, and he's just like, he didn't have an agenda. He didn't have a need. And people sense that need you have. He didn't have that need. They just was talking about his life and how, what he did. And she related to him. And so.
There you go. There you go.
All of that, trying to convince and all of that, for some people may succeed, but it was adversarial at that time, and he was finding what was interesting about it.
Yeah, for sure. Just to build on what I just said about the RPF thing, this is very real to me. So from just on exactly what you just said, the entire time I was in the RPF, what I did know is that these awful people around me who were, and by that I mean they were acting awful. Everybody in that, the RPF was the worst of what the Sea Org is, and the Rehabilitation Project Force. And thankfully they don't do it anymore. And that's not to say they won't bring it back tomorrow, but it was a cloistered prison system. And when you cage people, like pretty much like we were, the very worst of them comes out, and it's sleep deprivation, food deprivation, it's all of it. So if someone had approached me somehow in some fashion, if it could have occurred, that someone could have been my friend and had a friendly conversation with me, that would have been life-changing at that time. So I am 100% on board with what you're putting down here.
Look, people like people who are nice to them.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, it's like, we like that. We don't like people who give us a hard time.
That's right.
That's right. You're going to gravitate for people who make them feel good.
That's right.
But it has to be genuine. That's the whole thing. You can't fake it. You have. And so the people that have had longevity in this field, not all, but most, are people that are genuinely interested in ideas, genuinely interested in people, genuinely interested in the aesthetic, the art of ideas. They really, in their heart of hearts, they have that. And it's that curiosity that I think people feel.
Yeah,
and
agree.
And I think that's what we, in some way, it's difficult. We don't always succeed, but we try to teach that to families.
Yeah.
How to be curious.
Yeah, excellent. Let me ask you one more thing, and then maybe we'll move toward wrapping up. I was just curious about this myself from your experience. Have you found most people in this field, in the ex-cult world, are ex-cult members themselves?
Mostly.
Seems mostly, right?
Yeah. I mean, they're in the. So when I got involved in this, virtually everybody was a former member or a family member. And the organization that was the prominent organization was the Cult Awareness Network. And they did have some difficulties in their advocacy for kidnapping programming.
Yep.
The International Cultic Studies Association, at that time it was called AFF, the American Family Foundation, had a little bit more detached view. They were really interested in studying the phenomenon and providing recovery services for those who feel they were harmed. So when we look at groups, people say this group is horrible because it does X, and that may be true. But the universe of people that research is done on is not the universe of people like TM, the 10 million people have learned, nor is that research done on the 50, 40,000 people who are teachers or the graduates of the university. Nor is it done on the former members that have left. It's done on the former members who feel that they were harmed and who attend or associate with this group of people. So it's accurate for this universe, but not necessarily this universe.
Good point.
And so what the former president of International Celtic Studies Association, Herb Rosedale, who was an attorney, saw back in the mid to late 90s is that the future of this field was to get former members degrees, academics, that they become therapists, so they would have a path for a living outside of the cult field, and also the experience of it. And there's always this encouragement. And so that's led to all kinds of different people coming from different disciplines, looking at this phenomenon in very different ways. But I don't necessarily think someone has to be a former member. I think that there's a lot of similarities to a lot of experiences in people's lives.
Yes.
Of law, of being taken advantage of. It happens to us all the time. You know, somebody invested in a stock because a friend told them to invest in stock. Somebody, we do all kinds of things, not necessarily in the most rational reasons. And I think it's helpful for some people that people have experience, but it's mostly people, I think, that have had an experience. But for me, it's also healthy when they're no longer involved in this field. That's a real good sign because they've been able to move on, and this was a piece of their life. Like taking a university course or taking a training, they've graduated and they've gone on. But there are people that are, maybe more idealistic, like myself, that think that I want to take the experience that I had and help people or facilitate better understanding. And that's sort of personality driven. And I think this whole field is personality driven. Yeah. Different people's personalities affect how they approach the ideas. So there are, where there's self-selection, there are people we select, Joe Kelly, Ashlyn, Joe Simhar. These are people who are interested in ideas. And so we've self-selected these to be the people that we want to be around. And so, that our different approaches, although they're different, are similar. And it's the personality. Then you have people who are crusaders, and so I don't think of myself as an anti-cult person or a cult fighter. I once did. I just think of people in one-on-one. Can we help this situation, this one? Because, that big battle of fighting cults is for a young person.
I agree.
It's not necessarily for me. When I sued TM and was a real activist, and not understanding the nuance and the complexity of the situation, I knew we were going to be able to shut them down. And they were worth a couple $2 billion. And I think when Marcy died, they were worth about $10 billion. So all of that activism really didn't change that much. So I know very few groups that actually have been shut down, and very few groups that their teachers have gone to jail.
Right.
Very few.
That's right. It's really not. I'm not saying it's not a goal worth pursuing. Obviously, if you're an activist, that is a goal. But I think it's good to have a realistic view of the situation.
Can we reduce harm in a situation? That's important. So harm reduction is really the model. And look, there are people who think that there should be absolutely no drugs. And then there's people who think there should be harm reduction with the use of drugs. And these are different camps with different philosophical backgrounds. So I would come more from the harm reduction model. And so if you want a group to change, and you described in Scientology, the RPF is no longer there for now. Mm-hmm. So harm reduction has occurred. There has been a change that has been removed. And that's because of all kinds of influences. And so when you can... look, at ICSA conferences, there are groups that show up, right? And they make presentations. And when I worked for them, I had to be friendly with everybody. And in being friendly with them, they realized I was friendly. I remember there was some guru types that came and they do a conference, and I knew they were vegetarian, and I knew they didn't eat mushrooms, onions, or garlic. And so they had ordered the vegetarian plate, which was like a pasta with garlic and onions. So I knew that. So I asked the kitchen, could you make this person a fruit plate? So they said yes. So when the Hindu guy comes up, I said, here's your registration information, and I hope you don't mind, but I changed your meal from a vegetarian meal to a fruit plate because there's garlic and onions in it. And that person was shocked that I cared enough or was aware enough, and we became friends. Not friends. He's not coming over and hanging out, but we became friends at a conference. His wife makes me sweets, and we can have conversations about certain people that are being harmed in different ways, and legitimate change has taken place, not universal, but in certain temples, in certain environments, change has taken place. And so talking to people you disagree with, focusing on respecting them, you can bring about change. But if you don't communicate with people, if you don't, you get in your silo and they're bad because they're an academic who thinks one thing, you probably everyone's just going to stay siloed.
Yeah,
And
big time.
That's what we
Big
have
time.
in our politics. But Chris, that is personality. Somebody else is not going to be wanting to talk. They're not going to be curious.
That's right. That's right. I think I really do think it is that recognition of nuance, and I think it takes experience. I think it takes education. I think it takes some hard knocks, some humbling even. I know when I was in my activist phase, both in Scientology and then, when I first came out, for a few years, I was very, fuck those fucking fuckers, right?
Yeah, I know this.
Yeah, it's hard not to when you first get out. It's totally understandable. You have been victimized and you're just coming to the awareness of the victimization. Or if you weren't in the group, you have learned about the group and you've learned the very worst about them from social media. And it's not a nuanced picture that's painted. And so you want to go be an activist. You want to take them down. I'm going to take these fucking guys down. Hey, more power to you. I am not saying don't go be an activist, but there's a point when if you learn more, you engage more, you participate longer, you start see, you can't help but see. I think for a lot of people, at least, personality has a lot to do with it, but I think you start seeing those shades of gray start becoming, kind of clearer over time as the emotions wind down, the victimization winds down. You get some therapy, you get some education. You're like, oh, yeah, okay. Here was some good, here was some bad. And you know what? It's not evil to say there was some good and blah, 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 blee, blee, blee. And you get that, and I just think it's part of the experience. At least it has been for me on my wild ride. So, I can relate.
You did what we would want someone to do. You went and you got your master's, you challenged some of your own beliefs about things. You're forced in an academic, environment to do that. When you were talking, I was thinking back to when we sort of first started this conversation about going to this programmers meeting at the Cult Awareness Network conference. And I don't know, 50, I don't remember how many people were there, but it was a lot. And there's nobody, there's one or two of us that went to that meeting left. So those people who were the ardent fighters either got sued to death, they were in jail, they got burnt out. And there are few people that have stayed in the field and, that find joy in it and find, I keep on, it's redundant, but I keep on going back to curiosity. They're excited about ideas and, why do people believe what they believe and why do they experience what they experience? It's what life is, really, right? I mean, I live in a community that is politically in one particular direction, but there's neighbors who are very politically in another direction, and both are my friends. You know, we don't have to focus on things. I can say the things I disagree with, but without upsetting people.
Right.
And
Exactly. I
that's
hope today that for you all out in the audience, that we have given you some information that is not just about the cult world, that is about the human world, because it's kind of the same thing, really, and that's kind of our point, right? Joe, or sorry, Pat. I want to thank you very much for taking the time to speak with me about this today. Now, if somebody wanted to reach out to you directly, or find your website or whatever, where do they go? How do they reach you?
probably cultmediation.com
Okay.
or Cult News 101. We're kind of all over the web with putting out news or different perspectives on groups and religions and politics and health. And so either one of them or through you.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, you can always contact me as well. All right, folks. Thank you very much for taking the time to watch this today and sticking with us to the end. I think, personally, I think these kind of episodes, for me now, these kind of discussions are the most important ones I'm trying to have on my channel, because this is where it's really at. And all the lessons of all the years of, I people, ask about, are you a cult expert? And I always feel a little funny, not imposter syndrome. I know what I know, but but when I when I talk to people like Pat, I'm a little bit like, yeah, no, this is the experts, and it's because of that understanding of the nuance of it, and I think that's really the sort of the graduate level of this, that where it kind of should go,
Yeah.
So again, thank you very much, Pat, and we'll see you guys next week. Bye bye.